Okay, guys, sorry for the delay.
So
Everyone
what?
good? Give me a big yeah. If you're good. You good? Great. I hope everyone on Zoom can hear me as well. So, welcome to Somewhere Real session 185. I know, just stop with the applause. Thank you. Unexpected every time. Okay, guys, thank you for being so enthusiastic. So, for those who are regulars who have been here for a few years, you know that this is the first session we've had back in the bunker for almost 3 months. So, it's been 2.5 months since we've been in the bunker. That long. We were busy over peak season, high season, and finally we've got the bunker cleared and we're back to our regular sessions. Okay? So, because today we have about 10 or 11 new people, so I'm just going to quickly give you another overview and a review for those who already know about how this group started. So the group is called Samui Real Community, Critical Thinkers Community. It had a different name before, but we all agreed this is the best name for it now, given what's happening in the world. So we started this group in the height of COVID. So in 2021, March 25th, we had our first session in the front with 9 people, plus Robbie at the back. Everyone give a hand to Robbie. Robbie's waving. So Robbie pushed me to start this group, and so we started, the two of us. We got 9 people, sat in the front, had conversations. The second session is where we had our first presentation, and from then on it just grew by word of mouth. As you know, it's by word of mouth only. There's no publicizing on social media or anything, but we do now have a website up online because it's sort of more okay to talk about the things we talk about now. So the group has grown and grown. The numbers, the largest group we've ever had to date is 75 people in the bunker. So for a couple of sessions. So you can see on the mission statement, I sent it to everybody. The most important thing for a group like this, for any group, I believe, is the code of conduct and the guiding principles. I think somebody is recording. Okay, so pretend that there is no sound. That was just ET falling on. So now we've had 185 sessions. And you can see up there all the objectives that we go through, but the code of conduct and the guiding principles are the most important things, and they are more relevant and important today than ever. So if you go through them, first thing is to be accountable or take personal responsibility for your thoughts, your words, and your actions. Next one, specifically for our group, is to be aware of the ego as you acquire new knowledge. So don't look down on people who are less informed. Another important one is emotion, is striving to have mastery over your emotions when explaining to people or when having discussions. This one is super important, and I'm going to say it again. Everybody, you may disagree with the content of the talk, you may disagree with whoever you're having a discussion with, but it's important to adhere to the code of conduct. Otherwise, if we ourselves, given that everything's written on the wall in black and white for us as a reminder, if we can't even follow those rules and we can't be civil to each other just because we disagree, then how can we expect people out in the rest of the world to do the same? Okay, so this is really important. Mutual respect. Okay, so I'm going to cut it short because we're a little bit running a bit behind time. We have people on Zoom. Let's sort of say welcome to the people on Zoom. We've had about 698 people today that have come personally to the bunker. So today we have about 44, but we've had almost 700 people physically come at least once to the bunker for a talk. Many of those people were transient. They've moved on. They've gone back to their countries or back to other countries or to wherever they came from. And some of them zoom in. Like today, we have people in Australia, we have people in the Netherlands, we have people in Spain, in the United States, the UK, who are zooming in to this session. So I'm going to get right into it. I think I've talked enough, right? No? Okay. So let me introduce our special guest today. So all the way from Canada. Okay, last year we had a little mini conference, and our guest today is an author, a meticulous researcher, well known in the circles in which we move, and I'd like to present Cynthia Chung, or should I say Christine Cynthia Chung. And she is going to give a presentation today on the real politic of transhumanism and US military escalation towards China. quite a mouthful, even for me. So I just give you a little bit of background history about Cynthia, a little bit, and she'll fill in the gaps. So Cynthia is the co-founder and editor-in-chief of the Rising Tide Foundation, contributing author to The Clash of the Two Americas, which the two authors are sitting right here. She's also author of The Empire of Which the Black Sun Never Set, The Birth of International Fascism and Anglo-American Foreign Policies. Sorry, I erased it. And also recently she put another book out called The Shaping of a World Religion. My bad for not remembering it. The title is wrong, but fascinating. We've already got some people in the group who have started reading it. Right? So, ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for Cynthia Chung, who will give a 45-minute presentation followed by Q&A. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you so much. As I was saying, very happy to come back to Thailand. We enjoyed our trip here so much that we paid for our tickets to come back. All right, I'll just get started since we're kind of running late. My subject today is going to be the realpolitik of transhumanism and the U.S. military escalation towards China. Next week, Matt will be also covering the transhumanism subject, but more on the subject of the Arctic, around the Arctic maneuvering. So since Trump's inauguration, we have obviously many policies, many directions that we're changing in, and one of them is on the whole chip manufacturing situation. So for people who are not aware, there is a chip race for supremacy between the United States and China, pretty much because Taiwan and South Korea are known as the most advanced chip manufacturers. However, they are not strong enough politically to really be considered a threat by the US. However, China is a different deal. And so there's been a chip or semiconductor race. These are things that we need pretty much for everything in technology. It's going to be what governs the future in terms of who will be at the most advanced stage in the world, and that's why this has become a really hot subject. TSMC, which is Taiwan's chip manufacturer, is located in Taiwan. And for people who are not aware, Taiwan is the island off of China and is recognized by the greater majority, as in about 97% of the world, as legally part of China. In fact, the United States still to this day is legally recognizing Taiwan as part of China despite the threats of China having influence in Taiwan. So since Trump's inauguration, he has made some very big announcements in this field. I will go over them in a second, but I just wanted to share that there have been forecasts, because the reality is the United States has actually been lagging behind in the chip race. And there are big forecasts, big projections that by 2030, the US will have 20% of the global output of advanced semiconductors, which will have uses in artificial intelligence. And basically, this very ambitious projection, because the US doesn't really have much of a percentage global output at this point, it's going to come from Taiwan and South Korea. So TrendForce forecasts that the US will house about 22% of the global production capacity for these advanced logic semiconductors, which are for AI, by 2030, double the 2021 figure. So that's a crazy ambitious goal. Some might say impossible, but the reason why they think this is a reality is because Taiwan's TSMC, as well as South Korea's Samsung companies, who are the leaders right now in advanced chip manufacturing, are expected to actually invest very big money to produce these chips in the United States, which is very controversial and have pretty much has not come as a voluntary thing, but through threats from the United States to impose very high tariffs. With this projection of the United States increasing its global capacity to 22%, Taiwan is expected to drop from 71 to 58, and South Korea from 12 to 7%. Clearly, there is a cost that is expected for Taiwan and South Korea to pay in order for the US to supposedly become more advanced in this field. And we'll discuss the details of this throughout this presentation. The reality thus far is the US has actually dropped in its global chip production from 37% in 1990 to 10% in 2022, despite the US having a focus on chip production. This downward trend is expected to turn around with the aid of TSMC and Samsung. And again, the focus is on cutting edge semiconductors. So TSMC has recently announced it will invest another $100 billion in the US to build 3 more fabrication facilities, 2 plants to handle advanced packaging processes and research and development. There is clearly also an expectation that TSMC should share its trade secrets with the US in this deal. US production of advanced chips will be handled by TSMC and Samsung, and they currently have 70% of chip investment in the United States and are expected to increase their spending to the benefit of the United States. Donald Trump himself has made very ambitious statements saying the US chip output will be 40% of the global total. So this is a picture of something that happened very recently where TSMC's CEO, C.C. Wei, is standing alongside Trump and Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, and basically naming this deal where they're going to spend another $1 billion to build chip manufacturing plants in the US. And Trump, this has come basically in response to Trump saying that he was willing to impose additional tariffs on TSMC and Samsung up to 100% on chip imports. So this is a very big threat, most certainly not a voluntary decision, and one could argue, this was a threat that was not only threatening TSMC and Samsung, but the economies of Taiwan and South Korea, who are very dependent on these companies thriving. At this meeting, Lutnick said they want to avoid tariffs. If they're not here, as in the US, they'd have to suffer, and thus it's a good deal for them. Trump said we'll be at close to 40% of the market with this transaction and a couple of others that we're doing. That's a tremendous leap. Ironically, as I'm going to make the point further on in this presentation, the US wanting to piggyback off of TSMC and Samsung has a very likelihood of actually backfiring and slowing down the progress of TSMC and Samsung, and China will, in fact, have an easier time catching up as leader. Interestingly, just a few years ago, COVID was affecting the supply chain, but in reality, it wasn't really COVID as the ultimate source of the supply chain crisis. There was already a trade war between the United States and China. And the United States had shot itself in its own kneecap in the middle of this race for AI and chip supremacy, since the crisis of the chip backlog, which happened a few years ago, was as a result, a consequence of the United States forbidding China's access to necessary materials in chip manufacturing. And China has been focusing on the more lower end and moderate end chip manufacturing, whereas the companies I've been naming, as well as US, have been focusing on advanced chip manufacturing. However, the lower end, moderate end is about 95% of the market. And one of the markets that was hit very hard by this chip backlog was the car industry, which suffered a lot. Every car requires about 3,000 to 4,000 different chips and it's an incredibly complex process. So this reaction the US had to China actually affected economies all around the world very badly because China simply couldn't even produce enough to meet the demand. In 2020, December 2020, SMIC, which is China's leading chip manufacturer, along with other Chinese firms, were put on a US blacklist. And this was in order to prevent SMIC from basically competing in the market. So again, these types of actions have not been playing very fair with China, and it has actually pushed China into a corner where they have to become more and more self-reliant in the industry. And I don't think we can really blame them for that. So they had to start working on advancements. There's about 50 steps in a chip manufacturing. It's an incredibly complex situation, and so far no country is able to make chips on their own. Right now, there's a lot of countries who specialize in certain steps that are extremely high-level precision. It's so challenging that, even I think to this day, Netherlands is the only one that can do the lithography step in the chip manufacturing process. So it's very hard to specialize in all of the fields. So you can see the kind of hurdles that China has, where they're not only having to try to figure out how to make these chips with lack of materials and everything, but they have to actually innovate as well, since they're banned from using certain technology that was considered essential. But as we'll see, they were actually able to figure out a different route in bypassing the EUV process. What else do I want to say here? Nope, that's pretty much it. So SMIC is now, which is the Chinese chip producer, is now the third largest chip producer. Just a few years ago, it was a race between SMIC and Intel, but honestly, most people were laughing that SMIC could even be a competitor to Intel. And now today, SMIC is the third largest chip producer. So they are focusing on advanced chip production, but also the lower ends. So typically it's 7 nanometer, 5 nanometer, and 3 nanometer are considered the most advanced ones. And like I said, it's already a huge challenge to even figure these things out, which is why we see the US lagging behind in this. But it was incredible that SMIC was actually able to figure out how to make 7 nanometer chips a few years ago without EUV, which again was thought to be impossible. And it's interesting that people often will claim that China is copying. However, the reality is that with this economic trade war, China is becoming an innovator in these chip manufacturing processes and coming up with things that people thought that they could never accomplish. And at the same time, this is going to make it actually more accessible for other countries, and it's going to be increasingly less of a specialized field, which is good. You don't want technology to be in the hands of only a few. It's never a good thing. So in January 2022, the legendary TSMC R&D director, Dr. Bern Lin, mentioned in an interview that SMIC can even fabricate N5 equivalent chips. So again, it really shows that China is a genuine innovator at this point, and not just that, they are beating the United States in the chip war, and it has been the case for a few years now. But you would never know that reading Western media. So this is Nikkei Asia. I like to use Nikkei Asia because it's a Japanese journal, and so you know that when they're saying something about China that you need to, keep in mind in terms of Chinese innovation, you know that it's a balanced statement that they're making, because they're Japanese and they're clearly not on good terms with China right now. So in this article by Nikkei Asia, they're warning about the China shock in mature chips that is already hitting the world's market, but is going to be hitting much harder over time. And it's, again, ironic because China has been the only one really focusing on the lower and moderate chip ends. Like I said, TSMC, Samsung, the US, they're focusing on the advanced chips. China is focusing on all areas, and they've now come to such a place where they are the best manufacturers in the low and moderate ends and can supply these for crazy cheap prices, being the best quality. So it's a complete domination of the market that is predicted to happen. The SiC wafer, which is one of the components of semiconductors, the global leader in this was for years Wolfspeed, which was an American company. They were making it for $1,500, but Chinese suppliers now can offer a price of $500 or lower, just to give an example of the kind of competition that's going to be facing the United States pretty much beginning now. The SiC substrates are a critical material for making high voltage power semiconductors used in aerospace, electric vehicles, turbines, and data center infrastructure. Wolfspeed was trading less than $6 in February, down more than 96% their peak in 2021, when the world experienced the unprecedented chip shortage. The CEO of Wolfspeed had to resign because of the company's deteriorating financial performance. And there is even word that ROM of Japan have reported consecutive quarterly net losses since the middle of 2024. So this is a crazy competition that does not look like anyone will be able to compete with China with the lower and moderate end chips. This is also why the US has been talking about transparency in chip production so that you can choose which country you buy your chips from. But the reality is if you can only buy certain chips in one country and you need all these various chips and China can supply all of them for cheaper and better quality, it makes sense for your product line that you go with that just in terms of business and not in terms of politics. So China's mature chip capacity, which means not advanced chips, will account for 28% of the global market by 2025 and estimates of 39% by 2027. So you can see how what Trump is announcing, even though that might be a good intention, does not seem very realistic with what China is capable of doing already. The US has dropped its share from 37% in 1990 to 10% in 2022. And it looks like Samsung and TSMC are going to take a big hit with Trump's basically demand for them to invest heavily in the American market, which is going to be a very inefficient and sluggish process, to say the least, and incredibly expensive. This is the SMIC's growth of Chinese chip makers, just to give an idea of how fast it's growing. Its revenue hit $8 billion in 2024, and that's more than double its figure in 2018 before US-China chip war took off. So it's now the world's third largest contract chip maker, behind TSMC and Samsung only. Over 3 years ago, China began to be a real contender in the chip race. I don't know if we really need to talk about the 7 nanometer thing is good enough, but just to say that, again, this whole discussion of, China always having been behind the US for even a few years back was never honest. Asia as a whole has been dominating in the chip production sector, making up 80 to 90% of chip production in total. This is just a picture of the EUV technology that the US forced the Netherlands from selling with China. They actually wanted the Netherlands to also ban China from using DUV lithography, which is a lower order lithography technology, but the Netherlands actually refused because they said there was no basis for a security threat since this was old technology. And The reality is China is a major trade partner with the Netherlands. So this is Dr. Maurice Chang, the founder of TSMC. He even said in 2021, if you want to reestablish a complete semiconductor supply chain in the US, you will not find it as a possible task. Even after you spend hundreds of billions of dollars, you will still find the supply chain to be incomplete. You will find that it will be very high cost, much higher cost than what you currently have. So to be fair, the word impossible has been thrown around a lot. It's been thrown around at China as well, and it's been proven to be possible. However, Chang is the founder of TSMC, so that should count for something. And the reality is that the United States does not have the production capability today, and there's no indication of how it could create that production capability right now. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but the US has really downgraded its industry like across the board, where they don't even have basic car manufacturing capabilities right now. So we'll talk about the reality and consequences of these kinds of things shortly. Biden had announced the CHIP Act, which was a promise of $52 billion towards US domestic chip production. And this was made very clear, we're going to see in the next slide, that this was never to benefit the American people, because chips are used in everything. So of course, if we use them responsibly, they could be really used to increase the standard of living. You could really upgrade medical equipment. We could have really fantastic medical care is one really good example of a good thing that chips could be put into. However, the US has consistently mentioned only the military-industrial complex in their interest for chip investment. US Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo warned in an interview with CNBC. This was during the Biden administration. It's an older quote, so it's not a recent interview. But she said, if you allow yourself to think about a scenario where the United States no longer had access to the chips currently being made in Taiwan, it's a scary scenario. It's a deep and immediate recession. It's an inability to protect ourselves by making military equipment. We need to make this in America. Notice the only concern she names by name, the military-industrial complex. At some point, Americans need to ask themselves, what is the point of all of this military equipment if the American people's livelihood is not economically secure? In violation to the promise of freedom from want as one of the 4 core American freedoms, how is the American government providing the American people security if they do not even have enough food to eat and have no homes to live in, but increasingly ghettofied communities living like an ant colony? Or Elon Musk's ridiculous house box. They are literally selling boxes for homes as if this is some sort of luxury product. So why is it okay for Americans to increasingly have no access to the most basic of basic needs, while hundreds of billions of dollars are poured into the Department of Defense Frankenstein projects? And Dr. Maurice Chang even says himself that this money, no matter how much money you throw at this, and no matter even if TSMC and Samsung come to help with their knowledge, there is a physical limitation to what you can accomplish based off of your industrial productive capability, which is pretty much non-existent in the United States right now. This is a graph from the worldeconomics.com. China, as you can see with the GDP, is now surpassing the United States, and the big slap of reality is surpassing the United States in life expectancy. China is not just investing in their military capacity, but they are investing in all fields of industry, and you can notice this through especially the life expectancy statistics. China now has the second largest military in the world, but they are spending 2% of their GDP on their military, a number that even Trump says to Europe is the minimum they should be spending, while the US has spent many more times than this, to the detriment of their actual real industrial growth and the welfare of their citizens. The dramatic increase of a middle class in China used to be 3% in 2000. It is now 54% today, due to also investment in energy. This is one example of the incredible industrial growth going on in China, which is not focused on military. This is the rail lines that have been built since 2008 to 2020. These are the high-speed rail lines, and the US pretty much has none. This is what the US has done to their nuclear power plants, where they're pretty much shutting down the power plants. They're not planning on building any new ones. And the ones they do have are incredibly old and are going to be dying very soon. This is China's 14th five-year plan, where they are again announcing more and more investment into nuclear power to benefit the people. The demand for energy need is basically the determining factor for the social index of a country. The standard of living of a country is based off of the energy you have access to. So the United States, as you see, this is from 2021. I don't know how much it has changed since then, but it still gets the point across. The United States leads in nuclear power plants. However, it's minus 11 since 2011, and it's for certain minus more than that now. China has a 52, and it's plus 39 nuclear plants since 2011, which is quite the accomplishment. Building nuclear plants is a very long process. It's not something you can just create in mass quantities. This is a graph from 2022 of who has the oldest reactors in the world, and the United States has 41.6 out of 92, which are like among the oldest in the world, and China has 9 out of 55. So you can see it's a dying policy for the United States. This is the US funding for fusion energy, which, as we can see, you have the red line saying the fusion never amount of funding, and what the actual funding is, which is below the fusion never funding. Whereas China has actually been investing in fusion energy and has been making breakthroughs, despite for years people laughing at anyone talking about fusion energy as something that is just not applicable. Of course, now the United States is interested in fusion energy because of China's investment into fusion energy. And one of the leaders in this is the Lawrence Livermore Institute, where they do not hide the fact that their priority is US security and global stability. So not really much talk about how fusion energy can actually help boost the welfare standard of living of its people and increase the life expectancy. An independent commission established by Congress had concluded a few years back, if a potential adversary bests the United States in semiconductors over the long term or suddenly cuts off US access to cutting-edge chips entirely, it could gain the upper hand in every domain of warfare. The Center for Strategic and International Studies reports China's leaders have set a goal to build a fully modern military by 2027 based on informatization, intelligentization, and mechanization, investing heavily in technical areas which support such an approach, such as AI, quantum computing, hypersonics, and microelectronics. Notice here the irony that the greatest fear of the United States is that China does to the US what the US has in fact been doing to China all along. And all they can see as a benefit being on top in the chip race is military supremacy. There is never any discussion of how chip manufacturing will raise the standard of living of the American citizen. Their only statements are on domestic and global so-called security. The case with chip manufacturing is proving no different, with the US priorities and massive expenditure. Despite the fact that the CSIS report actually acknowledges that China's advances in chip technology are primarily driven by the development of devices for commercial use, not military use. Thus again, China is investing in things mentioned here, but has in fact much greater investment in the consumer and industrial markets. Thus, the military expenditures are not a priority for China's overall economy as it is for the United States. The United States has allowed itself to atrophy in these basic industrial productive sectors through no fault but their own. Here's a picture of Shenzhen, which is one of the hubs for chip manufacturing, and it's basically an ecosystem. So ironically, China is constantly being criticized as a centralized state. The government is controlling everything, and if the government doesn't like what you're doing, the government is going to, remove everything from you. The reality is that the US is losing the chip war largely because they are operating from a centralized system, which is in service to the military-industrial complex. And whenever you have a good scientist that's coming up with ideas in the United States, oftentimes they have a knock on their door from, a Lockheed Martin or whoever saying, sign this contract or something bad is going to happen. And as soon as you sign the contract, you have no more rights over your intellectual material. And of course, they decide what is killed in the cradle and what is carried forward, but only with applications to military supremacy. Ironically, in China, there is a decentralized process going on. So they are actually allowing for many companies to enter the market and compete with other Chinese companies and form an ecosystem for chip manufacturing. And this has actually been working out really well, even though it also means very brutal competition for the best that they're coming out with, even competing amongst themselves. It is a decentralized system, and as we're going to see, China's approach to AI is also bearing a lot of fruit. They're considered the leaders in AI at this point by many, because they are also using a decentralized system for AI application and research, which I'll go over later. What did I say? That's it. So this is a research paper that the Australian Strategic Policy Institute has released recently. And they looked into 44 fields of technological, competitive fields that are basically what they considered at the core of what is going to dictate technological supremacy in the future. And they found that out of the 44, China was leading in 37 of these fields, and the United States in 7 out of the 44. And they're listed here, although it's very small, but if people want a copy of the presentation, they can ask Pat, and I'll send it through Pat. So the reality is that no one is stealing from the US anymore, even though this claim is being constantly put out there, and certainly not China. What is there to steal from someone lagging behind in a race? Rather, the US has only its very own policies to blame for why its industry and standard of living have dropped for the American people. But they don't want to acknowledge this. China has not worked so hard to achieve this from an aggressive perspective. Rather, it is a focus on self-reliance. And can we blame China for this being a priority when the US has done everything it can to block China from participating in essential markets and world trade, and to hinder its production and participation in leading technological fields, while making very blatant threats of a military escalation towards its country? This is a picture of the BRICS expansion, and you'll notice that a lot of the countries who are getting involved with the BRICS are the global south. Almost literally the exact same countries that were part of the non-aligned movement during the Cold War, who got together. They represent by far the majority of the world population, saying they did not want to be stuck in the middle of the Cold War and forced to pick sides. They wanted to determine their own future, make their own decisions, and this was disallowed by the West, and they were forced to join the West side after many scary threats and assassinations, such as Lumumba. I think that's a very interesting graphic to give Westerners, at least, the Westerners who live in the United States who are very isolated and don't know very much about Asia, that there are more people living in that circle than outside of it. So the US has insisted on being number one at the expense of all others. This is what is motivating the multipolar world outlook, the global south that makes the greater majority of the world population. It is ironic that the US, that has created its own isolation in its aggressive attempt to isolate others, has created this situation for itself where it's lagging behind. They have sabotaged the attempts of Germany and France in their attempt to set up a European monetary fund outside of the Anglo-American hegemony. They sabotaged Japan in the DRAM markets, which is the memory chips, and they also sabotaged Japan in the Western intervention into their central banking system. This created a massive depression and huge suicide rate. It has banned countries like France and Japan from trading materials for nuclear plant production to countries like Brazil and South Korea in the past. The list goes on and on of how the US has kept a number one position, not through merit, but through aggression, threats, and sabotage. Unfortunately, this appears to be continuing in the case of Trump. His cancellation of the CHIPS Act is a good thing, since it was asking for the US to spend money it did not have on what were ultimately going to be military applications. In a country where the standard of living is drastically dropping, this is an immoral policy from even a purely American standpoint. However, Trump's answer to this has been to threaten with tremendous tariffs on South Korea and Taiwan if they do not spend billions of dollars to aid US in becoming number one. Has this not become embarrassingly transparent at this point? Is the US really going to be so arrogant as to claim they are number one by threatening countries who are leaders in their technological field to spend their own money to share their own trade secrets in order to benefit US supremacy, for which we are told needs to occur in order to protect these countries militarily? Domestic tariffs are fine. Under the McKinley model, Trump has brought this up in his speeches. However, what Trump is doing is not a use of tariffs to boost domestic production, which means increasing self-reliance and creating industries to meet the production demands. If this were the case, it would be funding such projects through their own credit system with the education of their own people to achieve such heights, not using the money and innovation of other countries by using threats. By putting a gun against the heads of other countries to hand over their technology, this will not benefit the actual intellectual creative output of the US. The US has rather quite literally become a parasite at this point, and it is in a collapsing state once a country accepts that identity. The excuse that these countries need to chip into US supremacy for their protection from China. Despite the fact that it is the US who has recently caused the greatest internal sabotage of these countries' economies, as Richard Werner has gone over in great detail in his book, Princes of Yen, where not only Japan was targeted, but the tiger economies were targeted, including Thailand. This is an imperialistic policy, and it is quite literally stealing, not a secretive stealing, but a robbery at gunpoint in plain sight for everyone to see, and somehow the Americans are not embarrassed by this. TikTok is another example of this hypocrisy. China had been criticized incessantly for limiting actions of such companies as Google to fully operate within their own country. They were criticized as not being an openly democratic country, but wanting to censor what Chinese could see outside their own country. Now we see the US not only making the same accusation to TikTok, but in addition are demanding that they sell a significant portion and ownership of the company, including its own algorithms. It certainly would be considered stealing if this situation were reversed. Ironically, TikTok, when it was temporarily banned, had a huge backlash. We had many young people, young Americans, who used VPNs to access TikTok and found access to the Chinese videos that they wouldn't have accessed with otherwise, and found that the Chinese youth were actually really similar to American youth, and also liked posting dance videos and humorous videos and cute animal videos. This backfired, and the US is not in a power position to dictate what should happen with TikTok. Another issue here is Trump's reclaiming of the Panama Canal. The president said the process has already begun. Ports in the canal that were built by the Chinese have been seized and have been sold to BlackRock. So not to the US government to reclaim Panama, but specifically to BlackRock, which is basically a Bilderberger type group. Trump has said recently the Panama Canal was built by Americans for Americans, not for others, but others could use it, obviously, with the insinuation if the US wishes them to. By the way, the canal was first built by Teddy Roosevelt, who illegally invaded the region and stole it from Colombia. So apparently China should have no right over Taiwan, which is in fact internationally recognized as part of China, but the US should be able to use the Panama Canal for just the Americans and seize ports that they did not build. Again, all of these actions are being done with the justification that China is still behind and must be kept behind because of behind the US for global security reasons, despite the fact that most of the world is in fact behind the multipolar framework for the world, in support of the multipolar framework. This is also why in Western media there is a constant attempt to frame China as if it is always lagging behind whatever successes they do and are not honest successes, but actually stealing from others. And this could not be further from the truth. In fact, China is leading in all areas, and thus we should ask ourselves the question, what is there to be afraid of China if China is already leading in all areas practically? Another example of the decentralization I was talking about was DeepSeek, but we don't really have enough time to talk about it. But what's very interesting about this company, very young company, small company, that has outdone the huge companies like Google and IBM, and obviously these companies and Microsoft, these are very concerning companies. And the small Chinese company that was founded by a man who was born in 1985 and who has hired the majority of his staff as recent graduates of Chinese universities. And the reason why he did this was because he knew that they would be the most fluid and creative. And he basically set them to work and to self-organize within his company and give them space to try out different things and so forth. This has borne immense fruit, and DeepSeek is considered the leader in AI right now and has beat Google and IBM and so forth. So again, just reminding, China is leading in 37 out of 44 fields. However, you wouldn't know about this being in the West. Papers like the New York Times constantly talk about how China is lagging behind. They tend to focus on the 7 fields that they're still leading in. And I think that the reason why they need to do this is to keep the fear up, actually. Because if people actually realize that China were leading in most things and nothing terrible has happened, the level of fear would obviously go down over time. I have a video. Oh. I don't think. We're going to just move on ahead because the videos are going to be too much work. So the next segment of this presentation is going to be talking about the transhumanism concept. So today, we're not meant to believe in the all-powerful abilities of the gods of the old, but rather our new God, which we're told is artificial intelligence. And unlike the gods of the old, we have created a new perfect God. Us humans who are imperfect have created what is apparently perfect intelligence. What we're told is an artificial intelligence. The irony in this should not be lost on anyone. I'm gonna maybe skip that section, but transhumanists think that our world is imperfect and thus we, ironically, are imperfect beings. We must thus intervene on the natural course of nature. We, or such few, I should say, should rewrite the laws and create anew according to these new laws in order to achieve their notion of perfection. Thus, an artificial intelligence fits right in with their artificial world, and hence the desire for humans to also merge with the artificial. To be a transhumanist is to reject the principles of natural law and to claim the ability to write new laws and form new creations. It is, in fact, to view oneself as God. On this idea of perfection, I just want to make a quick note that the Platonic Christians did not think we lived in a static world of perfection. Such great minds like Gottfried Leibniz thought we lived in the best of all possible worlds. This is true, but that was the key. What is possible is in reference to an unbounded, limitless potential towards perfection. Thus, there was nothing that was created in our world that was perfect, but rather shared in qualities of perfection that could always move towards a direction of greater perfection. For example, all living life partakes in the golden ratio. However, this is not to say that it is ever a perfect expression of the golden ratio. There is no perfect expression of the golden ratio found in nature. However, we can see that all life nonetheless strives towards this perfect expression. This is also the case in terms of truth and wisdom. No individual can attain perfect wisdom or knowledge of truth. However, that is not to say that absolute wisdom or absolute truth do not exist, nor that our understanding cannot follow its path and partake in its qualities. Thus, our universe was created with the principles of goodness and perfection, but it is not a static concept in the sense that we can always move closer to perfection and thus is unbounded and limitless, however, always governed by the structure or principles of natural law. The transhumanists reject that notion and think that they can create better laws. The problem with the worshipping of AI, there's a good example, which is Euclid's fifth postulate, which is that no two parallel lines can ever meet. However, we see that when we put parallel lines on a 3D curve, two parallel lines can meet at the top of the sphere. If we were to give AI this situation of Euclid's fifth postulate, it would not be able to come up with a rejection of it. And that's just one example of how AI is limited to the parameters we're given and ultimately is an enforcer of the dogmas that exist in academia. Game theory, zero-sum theory, limits to growth. AI, if it's programmed to receive those as its core parameters, will enforce those core parameters. Thus, instead of it being omniscient, it acts more like a manager for a system, the kind of managers H.G. Wells dreamed of to govern his world government. This is just an example. AI cannot tell us that the Big Bang Theory is wrong. However, as more data comes in, they move the goalposts over. So they cannot actually form a functioning theory. It's always working in an artificial scenario, which is very fitting for an artificial intelligence. But for science to really be science, you have to have a theory of prediction. Can AI predict the next man-made elements that we're going to create from the table of elements? We've already created man-made elements. When Mendeleev made the table of elements, he actually left certain places blank because he knew that there were elements that needed to be fitted there. This is again why AI relies on the data that we give it. It cannot make new discoveries. It cannot make a qualitative upshift. More data is quantitative, but discoveries are qualitative. Thus, it cannot challenge the parameters it is put in. It is rather an enforcer to what its creators want us to follow. And that's the danger with things like ChatGPT, which is being increasingly used as an oracle. People are treating it as something that is objective, when in fact it has been programmed to be very biased. And there's a lot of people who have actually come up to me bringing up the points that often what they ask ChatGPT will act like a censor or a fact checker and say, oh, that's a conspiracy theory. And then as you give it more data, it says like, right, that's true. So that's not really an honest operation system, if you ask me. Harari has said in an interview I think the biggest question maybe in economics and politics of the coming decades will be what to do with all these useless people. I don't think we have an economic model for that. My best guess, which is just a guess, is that food will not be a problem. With that kind of technology, you will be able to produce food to feed everybody. The problem is more boredom and what to do with them, and how will they find some sense of meaning in life when they are basically meaningless, worthless. My guess at present is a combination of drugs and computer games. So this is the argument they're putting forward, right? We're too incompetent, we're too imperfect compared to AI. We can't compete with different from the outlook of Yuval Harari, Elon Musk also being a big promoter of transhumanism. Thus, it's strange that in the MAGA crowds in the US, there is a disdain for Israel's Yuval Harari, which the WEF promoted, but there isn't the same sort of criticism for Elon Musk, who is promoting pretty much the same outlook. Matt Eric has written a fantastic essay that people can read on his Substack titled Elon Musk as Tesla 2.0, The Legacy of Technocracy Inc. and the Push for a North American Technate, which goes over how Musk's grandfather was the founder of the vision for a technate of America. The promise of transhumanism, I would gather, is actually made up of mostly empty promises such as the promise of immortality. And we should remember the story of Dorian Gray, who impulsively chooses to sell his soul and asks for the portrait rather than himself to age and fade. His wish is granted, and Dorian pursues a libertine life of varied immoral experiences while staying young and beautiful forever, while his portrait ages visually and records all of his sins and shows the ugliness of himself, basically. I feel that transhumanism is promising to fulfill the worst of our expectations and desires. For those who want to watch the YouTube videos, again, they can contact Pat and I can share it with everyone. So China's growing role in all our markets, including the chip market, almost done with the presentation, promises to help with the growth of countries in the global south as well, enforcing or facilitating much fairer trade in tech markets, including applications in medical care, energy markets, and so on, which are crucial for uplifting the standard of living. The only thing China is excelling in all these fields is threatening is the US's ability to continue its own threats. At this point, there is nothing that can stop China's excelling further ahead except for perhaps a World War III scenario, but even this window is closing fast. The National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence said, as the chair and vice chair of the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence put it in 2021, we do not want to overstate the precariousness of our position, but given that the vast majority of cutting-edge chips are produced at a single plant separated by just 110 miles of water from our principal strategic competitor, we must reevaluate the meaning of supply chain resilience and security. Eric Schmidt, who is the chairman of the US National Security Commission, I think he still is, on AI, or maybe not. Anyway, in 2021 he's the former chief executive officer of Google, and its chairman as well. He said in 2021, China's plans, resources, and progress should concern all Americans. We take seriously China's ambition to surpass the United States as the world's AI leader within a decade. What we're basically seeing is that according to the US, it's intolerable for anyone to surpass it, as we saw in the case of Japan, South Korea, Germany, France, because apparently only the US is trusted to be in the #1 position, and anyone who threatens that position is a military threat to the US. Such so-called patriots as Steve Bannon have come out with a strong support for Elon Musk's growing role in the Make America Great movement. As anti-China foment rises in the US over the fear of China as a techno-feudal monster that threatens to dominate the world like the Borg, we miss constantly We remain constantly blind to the fact that China has, in fact, increased the standard and quality of living of its citizens and life expectancy, which now exceeds that of the US. China has invested in all areas of industrial development in its society, while the US focuses on the military-industrial complex. And it is now the US who has become a loud proponent for the cause of transhumanism within the MAGA movement, specifically with Elon, or especially with Elon Musk. Why are Americans so concerned for what they think China might do while the very thing is growing inside their own country? Do American citizens think that they will be the only ones to benefit from their own transhumanist agenda? And if so, why are they not the very Borg threat they have been obsessing over? Has the US become the very monster that it claims to have been searching for overseas? The question remains, will Americans be so foolish as to support going to war against China to benefit a transhumanist techno-feudalist agenda and thus ensure their global supremacy? That is the end. Sorry, it ran longer than expected. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much.
Okay, guys, another hand for Cynthia. Thank you very much. Wonderful, thank you so much. Okay, don't run away, because now we're going to the Q&A. I'm sure I saw people thinking, I've got a question. Oh, the hands are up and I haven't finished. Okay, so I'm going to say here, guys, respect, mutual respect. Please try and ask the question and not make a long-winded statement. So everybody has heard me say this. Try and ask the question. And if you have to proceed that question with a little statement to give it context, fine. But not a long-winded statement. Okay? Right. I go to Rex first and then to Victor.
Not really a question, just thank you. Thank you for coming. And presentations, just like your book, I had to leave the room just to get some air. And I have to watch it again to begin to digest everything you presented here, and it's much appreciated.
Thank you, Rex. Okay, Victor.
Thanks, Cynthia and Matt. Great to have you here again. Very quick question. You mentioned BRICS, and one of the threats issued by Trump is levied against the BRICS and the BRICS countries. How do you see the movement, the BRICS movement, now with Trump in power?
Well, has Trump made any direct statements on BRICS?
Yeah.
What, fill me in, because...
Well, he's identified it as a threat that's seeking to create an alternative to the U.S. He's identified it, he's using a negative language so far that's identified it as a threat, seeking to undermine the U.S. supremacy of the U.S. dollar. Hopefully there's something behind the scenes, but that's so far he's got a very negative view of the BRICS so far. So.
Yeah, I would like to say also, just for the record, before addressing that I actually have been in support of Trump, and I was in support of Trump for his first term, and was in support of Trump up until his inauguration, until he announced a lot of policies and certain staff people within his government that are raising really big questions. Because for me, and I know actually a lot of people across the world, the people who were not American, the reason why they liked Trump was because he was basically promoting the stance that he would not be for war. That he thought the American presence in Syria was bad. He thought NATO, the US shouldn't be putting so much money in NATO. So these were like really big messages that the rest of the world was very hopeful that if that was the case, this was something manageable and workable. Even in terms of the trade war, there's a lot of people in China I know that have been very hopeful that as long as there is, even if you play hardball, as long as it's reasonable enough, it's manageable, and they want to have those kinds of relations. And the Chinese have said many times too on CGTN that they have no problem with the statement, "Make America Great Again." They think that any country should want to make their country great. The problem and the gray area is when you think that your country should be made great at the expense of others. So in terms of the BRICS process, I haven't seen any evidence to showcase that they're a threat in terms of like a military threat or a national security threat. They're a competition threat, and there are threats to the kind of supremacy of the U.S. dollar, but that is not a justification for the U.S. to say that they want to go to war with things, or they want to use very bellicose, threatening terms for these things. We are supposed to live in a fair world, right, where competition is welcome. And the United States has been saying those words, even though they have not in reality been playing by those rules. And again, you can just look at Richard Werner's book as a very good example, or what the US did for the Japanese DRAM markets under Reagan, where Japan was a leader in DRAM memory chip markets, and they were totally annihilated by the Micron shock by the US, that they also organized with South Korea, where they were hit from the top and the bottom in the markets to annihilate Japan as a competitor. And Reagan had started this by saying that it was Japan that was not being fair in supplying cheaper quality products in the United States. So these are problems that are real problems, and it really is hitting a point where, you know, it has to stop, where the US is posturing and constantly telling others what to do. In terms of the BRICS process, I think that it's very natural that countries would want to band together to offer themselves protection. And it's not a military protection, it's economic protection. The main issue here is economics, which is the standard for the welfare of the people. So by Trump doing that, I'm very disappointed. I mean, I'm very disappointed in what he did in Panama, where he sold the ports. Like, the Chinese built these ports, and if it was the US government who had taken possession of them, I would have been a little bit, you know, it's still not okay, but it would have been a little bit better. But he sold them to BlackRock. There's for me, it's really hitting a point where I can't justify it. And I've been, up until like just a few months ago, constantly thinking, well, maybe Trump is playing like this roundabout way, and maybe he's thinking about dealing, and he can't, because it's true, you know, in politics you have to make dirty dealings behind doors. Not everything is perfect and pretty, but it's hitting a point where it's becoming very concerning. I mean, Peter Thiel is also a massive funder for the Trump campaign and the Trump machine. So even if, for instance, Trump didn't want the outlook of a Peter Thiel, if you're accepting all of that money, you're accepting a certain amount of presence within your operations, how can Trump maintain control, even if he were theoretically to be opposed to a Peter Thiel? So these are the kinds of questions. I don't have the answers to how Trump is thinking, but it's only been a few months, and it's very bad. Like the TSMC Samsung thing, it's, for me, the way I view it is that it doesn't benefit Americans either. It's completely delusional. I think that it's a show of weakness and also insanity, because they're not going to become leaders in the chip market from this, and they're going to actually hurt not only their own economy chasing a wild dream, but they're going to hurt South Korea and Taiwan in this.
Okay, thank you, Victor, for the question. Thanks, Cynthia. Awesome answer. Okay, I'm going to jump over to Raima and then over to Mark.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your presentation lecture. I have one question. I'm coming from a country that in 1989 had a peaceful reunification, Germany. So people voted, and then we had a reunification, and not one thing thought was fired. How do you see the possibility that the reunification between mainland China and Taiwan will happen without a single thought fired? Because that would remove the big risk for hot war. We talk a lot about war, maybe it's a struggle for supremacy, but war is a different topic. Mm-hmm. So how do you see the possibility of a peaceful reunification?
I saw, a very interesting YouTube video where this YouTube channel, they go out and they ask the youth, but also people who are older, various questions, and it kind of gives you a feel for how people are thinking on certain subjects. And so in this particular video, they had gone out asking youth and middle-aged adults in Taiwan, what their view was in terms of the viability of a Chinese-Taiwanese military confrontation. And even for Taiwanese who were not happy with the idea of unifying with China, had no delusion that they could win that, but would also made what I thought were very telling statements of, we would have to just accept that I would not want to die in that war. So that was a consistent message that the youth was not interested in fighting in a war where they would die in that war in opposition to joining China. So it's a very different situation from Ukraine. Although, there was a huge chunk of the Ukraine population who also didn't want to fight in the war. But in Taiwan, it's especially very clear that no one wants to die over the subject, no matter where they position themselves opinion-wise. The other thing we need to realize is that if you ask the older generation in Taiwan that question versus the younger generation, you're going to have a different answer. Because the NED, the National Endowment Fund, which is an offshoot of the CIA, which are doing all kinds of re-education programs in Asia, including in Hong Kong. That's what was going on in Hong Kong for why the youth were saying the craziest things during Occupy Hong Kong, saying, we want to join Britain again. Where do you think that comes from? It comes from the NED. And Taiwan's youth has been, unfortunately, very influenced by NED education in their schools. But if you ask the older generation of Taiwanese who are more of the Kuomintang support base, although it is thought that there's going to be increasingly more support for Kuomintang, and there is the expectation that they will be elected in the next elections, and that will be a much friendlier space for dialogue between China and Taiwan. Ironically, Kuomintang, which was Chiang Kai-shek, who had the civil war with Mao Zedong, but the older generation does not see themselves as apart from China. They know that they're Chinese. They speak Mandarin just like the Chinese do. They have the same, they both love Sun Yat-sen. They both have Confucian teachings, education. It's pretty much the same culture, right? Like they are the same people, the same culture. They've only been recently split off for political reasons that started from the Chinese Civil War between Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong. So, but even this older generation that is pro-Kuomintang, which was supposed to be the anti-Mao Zedong group, they themselves say we should be unified with China. And the reality for Taiwan is the majority of its economic trade is with China. So if you were to ask, which the United States appears to not have any problems asking countries to not trade with other countries, even if it will mean the ruination of their own economy, Taiwan, if China, for instance, wanted to bend the knee, they could do it simply by not trading with them. That would be the fastest route. You wouldn't even have to militarily invade Taiwan. The reason why China hasn't done this is because they want to build good relations with Taiwan. They want a peaceful reunification, because why would you want a whole island of people who hate you and have felt that they've been forced to do something? China is not stupid. They don't want to do that. So there is a long process of dialogue, and I think they're trying to do a lot for trade benefits too, and they're trying to show goodwill this way. But that is the reality. China, if they really wanted to, they wouldn't have to do anything militarily to Taiwan.
Okay, thanks, Ranga, for the question. Thanks, Cynthia. I'll go to Mark first and then over to Rick. Now we have a question here.
Hi, Mark. Just a quick question about it. I just have a quick question about your thoughts on chip production. And do you think it is a security risk to countries that one country or continent is producing all of the chips? Is it possible for them to put
Is it possible for them to what?
to put the back door into these chips? And if we have all 5 of these chips here in America, in Europe, can they shut them down? Is it a security threat? And is it a valid pursuit to want to produce our own chips?
So if I understand your question, you're saying if Actually, I don't fully understand the question. Who's going to shut down the chip manufacturer?
But is it a valid concern that if Taiwan produce all the chips, they go into the class, there's 3,000 chips into a class, can they all then be remotely shut down? And is that then a valid security threat and a valid reason to want to produce your own chips locally? Is it such a big concern, or is it just not a concern?
I think that there is some concern over this, but however, I haven't heard anything concrete about that. And again, I read Nikkei Asia, so that I do hear the criticism or the concerns about these things. So Nikkei Asia is again very much at the forefront of talking about the chip manufacturing subject, and they're very hard on China. You know, they say very bellicose things like, "Oh, China claims Taiwan as part of the country," which is ridiculous because it's internationally recognized as so. So they go that far. And I have not heard from Nikkei Asia this sort of thing. However, I have heard them saying that the U.S. does want to implement transparency over where chip production is made, so you can choose what country it comes from. But it looks like it's more of a political decision to affect trade. I haven't heard of it. I wouldn't know how something like that would work, but it's a good question, and I would look into it myself because I'm going to write an upcoming paper on this sort of thing. But I have not ever heard it discussed on Nikkei Asia, and I would expect Nikkei Asia to bring up something as big as that. That would be a security threat for sure. But right now, it seems to be the security threat is having too much control over chip production in so little hands. And it seems that everything that China is doing is the opposite. It's to really disperse the chip production and obviously have a certain openness for the lower end processes. Obviously, the advanced chip manufacturing is top secret for good reasons.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Thank you, Cynthia. I go back to Rex with a question.
Actually, a couple of clarification and a question. The first one was, in my experience, if you really want to piss off someone in Taiwan, is to call them Chinese. And so I don't know how much they really identify with China. And in Hong Kong, it's also a similar situation. They have a specific word for mainland Chinese people, and so I don't know how much sort of integration is happening, especially with the destruction of Cantonese and so on. But isn't really the reason China hasn't invaded Taiwan not because they could economically swallow them up, because they're being protected by the U.S.?
The U.S. can't protect Taiwan. You should answer that question by looking at the situation of Ukraine. Did the U.S. protect Ukraine? What? The U.S. didn't want to protect Ukraine? I'm not talking about since Trump has been in 2 seconds ago. I'm talking about what has been occurring over years. With Victoria Nuland as well playing a huge role in that. I mean, the U.S. played a leading role in the whole Ukraine civil war before Russia went into the country to deal with that, because the reality is that on eastern Ukraine you have ethnic Russians, and the Ukrainian government under Zelensky was using a certain warfare which is common actually in this part of Europe, where you ban Russian, you're not allowed to speak Russian anymore. But there was also certain types of warfare that were occurring because in eastern Ukraine was where all of the resources were very rich. It's a very rich resource area in the grounds, and it was broadcasted on Ukrainian television that those people should just be annihilated. And your claim about Taiwan and Hong Kong people not identifying as Chinese and being insulted, I really don't think that is the case for Hong Kong so much, unless you're talking to, again, the youth. which are the NED, educated youth who are radicalized. And the same thing in Taiwan, they're radicalized, but I would say the Taiwanese youth are not, I don't think you would necessarily get a violent Hong Kong protest type situation in Taiwan, but never say never. But so far they haven't shown that they are of that kind of standing. But like I said, in Hong Kong, the youth were carrying around signs saying they wanted to become members of Britain again, right? So I would say that you have to realize that Hong Kong was a British colony for 99 years. So they were under British rule for that long. Obviously, you're going to have a lot of education and historical rewriting of things for one, and you can disagree with that if you want. But the thing is that the people on mainland China they went through the Civil War. They have memories of what the Civil War was between Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong, but also Japan also invading the country. And Hong Kong was a claim of the British from an unjust war, two unjust wars, the Opium Wars, and the British had a claim over Shanghai as well. I've done work on the drugs situation as well, and the drugs always came out of Taiwan, Hong Kong. You had the HSBC Bank also, which was involved in this, which is Shanghai. A lot of people are very ignorant about where the headquarters of HSBC is, which is the city of London. And I'm not the one to come up with this research. I don't tend to, come up with like raw data research. What I do is I read a lot of books, and then I, look into what I think is a storyline that is actually being backed up with reliable information. And so there are many researchers who have made this statement that it was not communist China ever that was involved in the drug production. It was Taiwan, Hong Kong. The triads were in Hong Kong, and you had the HSBC Bank, the Golden Circle. All of this was not under the purview of of communist China, although the West constantly, like through such institutions as the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, was caught lying about these statistics. And again, people who have done a lot of good work on this, for instance, Valentine, who wrote the Phoenix program, but he also did 2 books on the drug trade, Douglas Valentine. There's Henrik Kruger, who wrote the Great Heroin Coup. There's also the Whiteout. I forgot the name of the writers for that. But it's actually, if you look at so many of these books that were written during the 1980s, 1990s, 2000s, they're all saying that. It's not from just a few books. So you have to acknowledge this. And, my mom is from Hong Kong. So I know my mom is also not friendly to China. But I've also found that she actually she's not consistent in her understanding of things. And she'll even attack Confucian values as something oppressive, but then she won't actually, you ask her, please explain to me how you view Confucian values, and she can't actually explain it. So I think that there has been a lot of division, and this has been done greatly by the beginning of the Opium Wars with the British, and then the British there has been a lot of division, and this has been done greatly by the beginning of the Opium Wars with the British, and then the British on free markets, and that the British never applied to themselves their right to push heroin on the Chinese. But it's been something that has also continued to be enforced by the Americans, and the NED in particular is playing a huge role in the education. But if you were to talk, like I said, to older Taiwanese people, they're not necessarily going to say, I am Chinese like someone on the Chinese mainland, but they are also not going to look at the people who live in China as someone who's not their brother or their sister. So you have to be very careful with how you talk there.
Okay. Thank you. very much, Rex, for that good question. I'm going to the last question of the night, just because everyone's getting a bit tired. It's getting late, so bear with.
I have to say there's a lot of comments, but I'm going to stick it to the question. Chinese university students make up the vast majority of the American graduate population in the university system. Intellectual theft is a very major issue amongst the university professors, projects and research grants. The Department of Defense has explicitly called out any national security potential patents or any intellectual property is not to be actually filed at the current moment because of the level of Chinese espionage and theft of intellectual property in America. Your statements on China is developing on its own are summarily false. China has been proven in the latest situation of DeepSeek to be using the H100 chips from NVIDIA, even though they claim, which are under the export controls and the restrictions to be able to use them. They are getting them out of Singapore, and they lied directly to the American media and the major media centers to say they were the H800 chips, which were not part of the scenario. How do you resolve the fact that China is still conducting illegal search and being able to get equipment outside the export controls to be able to develop the technology like DeepSeek?
I think I'll answer your question very simply. Why is the U.S. nowhere near number one position? Why has the GDP dropped drastically and the life expectancy? If they're the leaders and everyone is stealing from them and they're so great, why are you not seeing concrete results in the United States?
Good.
I think that's the biggest measure there. That's my answer to your question.
Okay, guys, so to be continued. This is not over. This is not over. Let's get the big Cynthia, thank you so much. Okay, so now is the nice part about this session is now we go to the front and then you can ask us lots of little questions that everybody has. We go to the front, socialize, have a drink, and then you can ask more questions. But once more, the front bar, okay? But once more, please, a big hand for Cynthia. Thank you.